Hey, adventurer. Welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're peeling back the romanticism on one of history's most iconic figures to reveal the grim, flea-bitten reality beneath the stoic veneer, the wandering Ronin of Edo period Japan. We're here to explore exactly why their famous life of solitary wandering was less about poetic justice and dramatic sunsets, and more about desperate poverty, social anxiety, and possessing the advanced skill set of a medieval special forces operator in an era of mandated peace. In short, we're here to explore why being a masterless samurai profoundly and almost comprehensively sucked. You've seen him 1,000 times. He's in the movies, the manga, the video games, a lone figure, silhouetted against a blood-red sun or a full moon. His silhouette is sharp, defined by the long and short swords, the daisho, at his hip, and a silhouette often framed by a battered straw hat. His hand rests calmly on the hilt of his katana, his gaze steely and unreadable. He is the wandering, masterless samurai, the Ronin, an avenging angel or a wandering spirit of justice, a tempest of steel wrapped in a calm demeanor. He walks into a town corrupted by greed, rights the wrongs with a few impossible, lightning-fast strokes of his blade, and then wanders off into the sunset, refusing payment, forever a ghost on the wind. It's a powerful image. It's cool. It's iconic. And it is, for the most part, absolute, unadulterated nonsense. Trust me, being a real Ronin in the long, grinding peace of the Edo period was nothing like a Kurosawa film. It was a life defined less by noble purpose and more by gnawing hunger, chronic dampness, and the kind of social anxiety that comes from being simultaneously overqualified and unemployable. It was itchy, undignified, flea-bitten, paranoia-inducing work, and for the vast majority of men who lived it, it profoundly, comprehensively, and existentially sucked. Their story wasn't one of a lone wolf, proud and dangerous. It was closer to that of a stray dog, a creature once belonging to a proud house, now cast out, viewed with a mixture of pity, fear, and contempt. Always hungry, always on edge, sleeping in ditches and abandoned shrines, snarling at anyone who got too close, yet still carrying the faint muscle memory of a nobler existence. The Ronin wasn't striding stoically into the sunset. He was trudging through mud, his stomach complaining louder than his sense of honor, trying to remember the last time he had a meal that wasn't just boiled millet and regret. His piercing gaze wasn't contemplating the nature of justice. It was a frantic, internal calculation of how many days he could survive before having to pawn his companion's sword, the wakizashi, an act of such profound shame it was barely preferable to starving. Now, before we wade deeper into this bog of historical misery, if you appreciate this kind of unflinching look at the past and enjoy seeing romantic notions dismantled with historical facts and a healthy dose of sarcasm, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. It's the single best way to support the channel and ensure we can continue our journey down these less traveled and, frankly, quite depressing historical roads. And please, let me know in the comments below which romanticized historical figure you think deserves the Weary Wanderer treatment next. I'm always looking for new icons to tarnish. All right, I hope you're in a comfortable spot. Perhaps you're in a supportive chair, enjoying a beverage that isn't teeming with invisible microbial threats, in a room that is a stable, comfortable temperature. I want you to savor that for a moment, because we are about to leave it all behind. We're going to walk a mile, or more accurately, hundreds of miles, in a pair of very worn, very leaky straw sandals called waraji. Forget your Wi-Fi signal, your savings account, your career goals. Your new concerns are the persistent leak in your straw cloak, the 3 days of hunger clawing at the inside of your belly, and the 2 swords at your hip that are simultaneously your only remaining status symbol, your only real skill set, and the heaviest, most tragically useless burden you can imagine. Let's begin. So how does one choose the glamorous life path of a Ronin? The simple answer is, you don't. No samurai child, while practicing sword swings until his arms felt like wet noodles, ever thought to himself, "You know, I hope one day my lord gets his entire domain confiscated by the shogun, so I can be unemployed and forced to wander the countryside, fighting bandits for scraps of food." That wasn't the dream. Becoming a Ronin wasn't a career choice. It was a catastrophic system failure. It was the historical equivalent of being laid off. To understand the Ronin, you first have to understand the man he was supposed to be, the samurai. And you weren't so much born a samurai as you were forged into one, usually against your will, in a process that started from the moment you could walk. You were funneled into the noble, back-breaking, and emotionally repressive lineage of the warrior class. No trust fund awaited you, no cushy sinecure, just the family's ancestral swords, a legacy of rigid expectations, and the ever-present, soul-deep understanding that your life was not your own. It belonged to your lord, your daimyo. Your childhood was, by modern standards, a festival of horrors, designed to stamp out anything resembling individualism or weakness. While a peasant child might be learning to, laugh, you were being taught the fine art of enduring pain without flinching. Your toys were a wooden practice sword, a bakken, and maybe a small, lethally sharp knife, the tanto, for which you were taught the proper way to commit ritual suicide, or seppuku, before you were taught long division. Fun times. Your playground was the dojo and the training yard, a place of sweat, blood, and constant low-grade terror. Your primary instructor was likely your own father, or perhaps a senior retainer, a man whose face was a roadmap of battles you would never get to fight, and whose vocabulary consisted mainly of grunts, sharp corrections, and the occasional bone-chilling story about a warrior who chose an agonizing death over a moment of dishonor. He was the living embodiment of the Bushido Code, a complex set of ideals emphasizing martial prowess, unwavering loyalty, and a complete and total disregard for your own personal safety or comfort. He taught you everything not through patient explanation, but through brutal repetition and the occasional character-building whack with a bamboo sword. While other children were playing games, you were mastering the grim arts. You learned to ride a horse in full armor, to fire a bow with deadly accuracy, and of course, to wield the katana. You'd spend thousands of hours on the soburi, the practice swing, until the motion was as natural as breathing. This wasn't just physical training. It was spiritual forging. The goal was to achieve mushin, the mind of no mind, a state of such perfect focus that you could react in battle without thinking. And there was a certain austere beauty to it, a genuine awe-inspiring coolness. To master these arts was to feel a connection to generations of warriors, to stand with your fellow young samurai, all of you bound by the same code, the same duty, was to feel a sense of belonging so profound it bordered on the sublime. You were part of something vast, ancient, and deeply important. You had a place in the cosmos. You mattered. Your purpose was clear. You would live and die in service to your Lord. It was a hard life, but it was a simple one, and it had meaning. And then, one day, it was all gone. See, the great tragedy for the entire samurai class was the arrival of peace. For centuries, Japan had been racked by civil war in the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. It was a seller's market for skilled swordsmen. But then, the Tokugawa clan unified the country. The wars ended. And the new shogunate, in its infinite wisdom, began consolidating power. They did this through a policy called kaiyeki, which is a polite term for asset forfeiture. If a daimyo died without an heir, or backed the wrong side in a political dispute, or sneezed improperly in the shogun's general direction, the government could, and often would, dissolve his entire domain. For the daimyo, this was a disaster. For his thousands of samurai retainers, it was an apocalypse. Imagine it. One day, you are a respected member of the ruling class. You have a stipend, paid in rice. You have a home in the castle town. You have a social standing. You have a purpose. The next, a proclamation is read. Your clan is disbanded. Your lord is dispossessed. Your rice stipend is cut off. You are ordered to vacate your home. You are, in a single instant, unemployed, homeless, and without purpose. You have been trained your entire life for one specific job, honorable high-stakes violence, and that job has just been eliminated. You are now, officially, a wave man. A ronin. A man adrift on the waves of fate. All that brutal, painstaking training? All those lessons in loyalty, honor, and glorious death? Suddenly, tragically, useless. Your father had prepared you for a glorious death on the battlefield, but he had left you utterly, hopelessly unequipped for the far more likely and far more humiliating reality of life. Figuring out how to pay for your next meal. Holidays? Weekends? Paid time off? These were adorable concepts, about as relevant to a ronin as the orbital mechanics of Jupiter. The road didn't keep a calendar and hunger didn't take breaks. For the wandering ronin, time wasn't measured in days or weeks, but in a relentless, grinding cycle of discomfort, hunger, and motion. There was no end of the shift. There was only the brief, troubled pause between one miserable day and the next. A typical day for our hero began not with the gentle song of a bird or the warm light of dawn, but with the cold, creeping dampness seeping through his straw cloak. He wouldn't wake in a bed, but would more likely uncurl himself from the base of a tree, the corner of a dilapidated and forgotten shrine, or, if he'd been truly unlucky, a ditch by the side of the road. The first conscious thought was rarely one of noble purpose. It was a dull, physical inventory of aches. The back, the knees, the feet. Oh gods, the feet. All singing a chorus of complaint from sleeping on the hard, unforgiving ground. The second thought, arriving immediately after the first and infinitely more pressing, was food. A gnawing, hollow emptiness in the gut that served as his only reliable traveling companion. Breakfast, if it happened at all, was a sorry affair. It might be a small, sad rice ball saved from the previous day, now cold and hard as a rock. It might be a handful of foraged chestnuts, or in truly desperate times, just a long drink of water from a stream, with the silent prayer that it wouldn't result in a week of debilitating dysentery. Then, it was time to work. And the work was walking. Endless, monotonous, soul-crushing walking. He would hoist himself to his feet, adjust the two swords at his hip, a constant, heavy reminder of his failed status, settle his conical straw hat, and begin to move. The goal was always the next town, a place that shimmered in his mind with the vague, desperate hope of finding employment, a hot meal, or at least a barn to sleep in that was only moderately infested with rats. But the environment itself was a constant, active antagonist in this daily drama. It wasn't a scenic backdrop for his noble journey. It was a capricious tyrant with a very personal grudge against him. The rain in feudal Japan wasn't the gentle, poetic mist you see in woodblock prints. It was a cold, drilling, soul-saturating deluge. It fell for days on end, turning the primitive roads into a quagmire of sucking, grabbing mud that would pull the straw sandals right off his feet. Every step was a slick, uncertain gamble. His cheap straw cloak, or mino, would become saturated within an hour, hanging off him like a leaden, dripping shroud, ensuring he was perpetually chafed and chilled to the bone. And the sun, oh, the glorious Japanese sun of summertime. It wasn't a gentle warmth. It was a celestial blacksmith's forge, a cruel brassy eye in the sky that beat down relentlessly, turning the air into a thick, humid soup that was difficult to breathe. The sweat would pour off him, soaking his already filthy kimono, attracting swarms of biting flies and mosquitoes that saw him as a personal, mobile buffet. The world would shimmer with heat, and the dust of the road would cake his face and get into his eyes, his throat, everywhere. The wind wasn't a refreshing breeze. It was a hot, dusty exhalation from the lungs of a cantankerous god, offering no relief, only rearranging the misery. And then, there were the smells. The olfactory landscape of the Ronin was an ode to misery that would follow him everywhere. It was a complex bouquet, starting with the bass notes of his own unwashed body, an aroma of sweat, grime, and despair. Layered on top was the scent of damp, slowly rotting straw from his hat and cloak, the sour tang of his frequently wet clothes, and the earthy, slightly fungal smell of the road itself. When he passed through a village or town, this private scent collection would be augmented by the powerful stench of open sewers, animal waste, rotting garbage, and the smoke from countless charcoal fires, all mingling into a single, overwhelming assault on the nostrils. This was the air he breathed, the scent he lived in. It was the perfume of his station in life. The sounds were no better. The soundtrack to his day was a symphony of suffering, the endless squelch, squelch, squelch of his sandals in the mud, the incessant, high-pitched whine of mosquitoes in his ear, the low, ominous rumble of his own empty stomach. In towns, it was the suspicious whispers of merchants as he passed, the nervous barking of dogs, the sudden silence that would fall over a tavern when he ducked inside, looking for work. He was a walking disruption, a physical embodiment of social failure, and the world reacted to him with a quiet, yet palpable, hostility. His primary discomfort, beyond all else, was his feet. The straw Waraji sandals were cheap and fell apart with soul-crushing regularity. Walking all day, every day, on rough, uneven paths, in flimsy footwear, meant his feet were a constant tapestry of blisters, cuts, and raw, weeping sores. Every step, for miles and miles, was an exercise in pain management. And yet, even in this ocean of suffering, there were moments, tiny fleeting islands of grace. Sometimes, cresting a mountain pass at dawn, he would see the world unfold below him, a sea of mist from which the tops of mountains emerged like islands in the sky. For a brief, breathtaking moment, the hunger, the cold, the aches would fall away, and he would be not a failure, but a poet, a witness to a beauty so profound it bordered on the divine. Or perhaps he would find a secluded waterfall, the roar of the water a clean, powerful sound that washed out the drone of insects and the whispers in his mind, and for 10 minutes he could just sit on a rock and feel something other than tired. These moments were rare. They were dangerous. They offered a glimpse of a peace he could not have, a beauty that made his own squalor all the more acute. They were the punctuation in a long run-on sentence of misery, a brief intake of breath before the slog began anew. The daily grind wasn't about epic duels. It was about surviving the walk to the next town, only to be met with suspicion and rejection, and then being forced to find a ditch to sleep in that was marginally better than the last one. A man is defined by his tools. A farmer has his hoe, a carpenter his saw, a calligrapher his brush, a samurai has his swords. But for the Ronin, his entire collection of worldly possessions was less a set of functional tools and more a traveling museum of personal failure. Each item he carried, from the magnificent blade at his side to the crumbling sandals on his feet, was a ghost of his former life, a constant, physical reminder of the man he was supposed to be and the destitute vagrant he had become. This wasn't a warrior's kit. It was a curated collection of burdens. Let's begin with the centerpiece, the most iconic and the most problematic items in his possession, the daisho, the matched pair of long and short swords. First, the katana, the long sword. This was not merely a weapon. Oh no, that would be far too simple. The katana was, according to the code he'd been beaten with since childhood, the very soul of the samurai. It was an extension of his being, a work of art forged in fire and faith, a masterpiece of metallurgy. In a proper samurai's hands, a well-maintained katana was a thing of terrifying beauty. Its blade, forged from meticulously folded layers of tamahagane steel, could feature a grain pattern as subtle and unique as a fingerprint, and its hardened edge, the hamon, would show a temper line like a milky wave against a steel shore. Its balance was perfect. In the hands of a master, it was capable of acts of seemingly impossible lethality and grace. It was, without a doubt, one of the finest cutting instruments ever devised by human hands. And that is precisely what made it so infuriatingly, heartbreakingly useless to our Ronin. The first problem was maintenance. A soul, it turns out, requires a lot of upkeep. A katana blade is high-carbon steel, which is a fancy way of saying it is fantastically susceptible to rust. To prevent his very soul from corroding into a worthless stick of orange metal, a samurai needed a whole cleaning kit. This involved tapping the blade with a silk powder ball of uchiko to remove old oil, wiping it clean with soft rice paper, and then applying a fresh thin coat of a special mineral oil, choji oil, to protect it. Now, where does a man who sleeps in ditches and considers a stolen turnip a good day's haul acquire a steady supply of fine rice paper and expensive aromatic oil? He doesn't. Every drop of rain, every humid night spent sleeping outdoors was a direct assault on the one item that tethered him to his former identity. He would likely wake up and, before even thinking about his own hunger, frantically draw his blade, his heart pounding, just to check for the dreaded orange speck of a new rust spot. Finding one would be a moment of pure, gut-wrenching horror. It wasn't just corrosion. It was a physical manifestation of his own decay. A sign that he was failing, not just as a man, but as a samurai. He would try to improvise, using a dry leaf to wipe it down or a piece of his own ragged kimono. But it was a losing battle. His soul was rotting, one humid afternoon at a time. Furthermore, this masterpiece of martial technology was spectacularly ill-suited for any of the problems a Ronin actually faced. It could decapitate a man in a single fluid motion, but it was a clumsy and inefficient tool for chopping firewood. It could slice through a bamboo practice target, but it was far too precious to risk chipping on a rabbit's bone while trying to prepare a meal. It was a weapon of war and noble duels, but his daily battles were with hunger, cold, and loneliness. Trying to use a katana for simple survival tasks was like trying to use a Stradivarius violin as a canoe paddle. Then there was the social aspect. Walking into a village with a katana at your side wasn't like carrying a briefcase. It was like walking into a modern-day preschool with a loaded shotgun. It immediately marked you. To commoners, it was a sign of danger, a promise of potential violence. They would stare, whisper, and hurry their children indoors. To the authorities, the local constables or a visiting shogunate official, it was a giant flashing neon sign that read, "Potential insurrectionist." You were a loose cannon, an unemployed killer in a society obsessed with order. The swords that were the very symbol of your elite status were also the reason you were treated like a pariah. Finally, the katana was a magnet for the worst kind of attention. It was an open invitation to every other desperate, half-mad Ronin looking to test his skills, or to every arrogant, well-fed samurai in the employ of a local lord who wanted to make a name for himself by killing a so-called master. Our Ronin didn't want to fight. A duel meant risking injury, which without medical care was a death sentence, or damaging his sword, which was an even worse fate. He just wanted a bowl of rice. But the sword at his hip screamed, "I am a warrior," attracting exactly the kind of trouble he was trying to avoid. It was less a weapon and more a terrible, cursed liability. Next in this parade of inconvenient heirlooms is the wakizashi, the companion sword. Shorter, handier, and just as much of a headache. Its traditional purpose was for fighting in close quarters, and most grimly, as the tool for seppuku. If the katana was the samurai's soul, the wakizashi was the guarantor of his honor, the final exit strategy that allowed him to die with dignity. For our wandering ronin, however, its primary practical function was far more pathetic. It was his emergency fund. It was the one thing of value he might be able to pawn. To even consider this was an act of profound, soul-crushing shame. Imagine the scene. Our hero, his stomach a hollow cave of hunger, standing outside a grimy pawn shop, his hand trembling as he considers trading the very instrument of his honor for a few coins to buy food and a roof for the night. The act of pawning the wakizashi was a public declaration that his belly had finally won its long, brutal war against his principles. It was selling a piece of his spirit to survive another week, a transaction that would leave him feeling even more hollow than before. And what about armor? The magnificent lacquered suits of a warrior? Forget it. A full suit of Tosei Gusoku was incredibly heavy, cumbersome, and made a terrific amount of noise. It was also immensely valuable. Any ronin who still possessed his full family armor had likely sold it off piece by piece long ago for food and lodging. But maybe, just maybe, he kept one piece for sentimental reasons. Perhaps a helmet, a kabuto, or a chest plate, the do. This single piece of armor was the ultimate useless souvenir. It offered excellent protection against a volley of arrows in a pitched battle, but was infuriatingly inadequate at keeping out the rain. It was a heavy, awkward, clanking burden that served only to remind him of the glorious battles he would never fight. He might use his helmet as a makeshift basin to wash his face, or his iron shin guards to prop up a cooking stick, a sad domestic end for an object forged for war. As for his state-of-the-art personal protective equipment against the elements, it consisted primarily of a kimono that had seen better centuries. It wasn't the fine silk of his former life, but a garment of coarse hemp or faded cotton, its original color now a vague, indeterminate brownish gray. It was less a piece of clothing and more a geological record of his recent suffering, with layers of mud from the Tokaido Road, stains from unidentifiable food, and the faint but permanent patina of his own sweat. It was patched with mismatched scraps of cloth, and its threadbare sections offered about as much protection from the biting winter wind as a strongly worded suggestion. Over this he wore a mino, a cloak woven from straw. In theory, this was rain gear. In reality, it was a mobile ecosystem of misery. It would absorb water rather than repel it, becoming fantastically heavy. It smelled like a wet dog that had been sleeping in a swamp. It shed constantly. And it was a 5-star hotel for fleas, lice, and other tiny, unwelcome companions who enjoyed the damp, dark conditions and the readily available food source that was our ronin. And finally, we arrive at the foundation of his misery, the waraji, his straw sandals. These were, without exaggeration, one of the most diabolically inadequate forms of footwear ever conceived. Woven from straw rope, they had the structural integrity of a damp paper towel. A walk down a gravel path felt like a calculated torture session. They offered zero protection from rocks, mud, or water. They would come untied constantly, forcing him to stop and refasten them with cold, numb fingers. And they wore out with shocking speed. A traveler might carry several spare pairs, but our ronin likely had only the ones on his feet and maybe one extra. He would spend his evenings not in quiet meditation, but in the frustrating, mundane task of trying to weave new sandals from scavenged bits of straw. His warrior's hands, trained for the delicate art of the sword, now fumbling with the clumsy craft of a peasant. And yet, despite this daily catalogue of failures and frustrations, these tools were his life. He cursed his swords for the trouble they brought, but he would also spend the last of his energy meticulously cleaning them. He would curse his ragged kimono, but he would also painstakingly patch its holes. He was bound to these objects, this collection of decaying status symbols. It was an unholy matrimony, a bond forged in shared misery and mutual disrespect, a constant nagging reminder that everything, including his very soul, was slowly but surely falling apart. If our Ronin's possessions were a museum of personal failure, then his own body was the star exhibit. It was the ledger book where every miserable day inscribed its entry. Every league walked, every cold night slept on the ground, every missed meal, every moment of fear. It was all meticulously recorded in the currency of pain, scarring, and slow, systemic decay. The proud, strong physique of the samurai, forged in the dojo through years of punishing training, was being systematically dismantled by the far more patient and brutal discipline of poverty. By the time he reached what a pampered court noble might consider his early prime, say 30 years old, our Ronin's body was already a comprehensive anthology of occupational hazards. Let's open this grim textbook and study it, chapter by agonizing chapter. First, the architecture, his musculoskeletal system. His spine, once held ramrod straight with martial pride, likely now resembled a question mark. Years of walking with a slight stoop against the wind and rain, sleeping curled on uneven ground for warmth, and carrying the weight of his swords and his shame had twisted it. A deep, persistent ache in his lower back was his constant companion, a dull throb that was the bass note in the symphony of his pain. His joints sang arias of agony, especially when the weather turned. The cartilage in his knees, worn thin by a million thankless steps, would grind and pop. He likely suffered from what we would call debilitating arthritis, a slow, grinding tenant that had taken up permanent residence in his hips and ankles, paying its rent in flares of stabbing pain that could bring him to his knees, and his hands. Oh, his magnificent, ruined hands. These were hands that had been trained to be instruments of sublime grace and deadly precision. They had learned the intricate art of gripping a katana, the subtle wrist movements for a perfect cut, the delicate pressure for calligraphy. Now they were a gnarled tragedy. They were the hands of a manual laborer, which, to his profound shame, is what he had become. They were thick with calluses from gripping a walking staff, from chopping firewood, from weaving his own wretched sandals. His fingernails were broken and dirty, the skin on his knuckles cracked and bleeding from the cold. To look at his hands was to see the story of his fall from grace written in scar tissue. Then there were his feet, the unsung heroes and primary victims of his daily grind. They were a perpetually mutilated mess. A constant overlapping cycle of blisters would form, swell with fluid, and then tear open, leaving raw, weeping patches of skin that would inevitably become infected. He'd walk on these open sores until the pain was a white-hot noise in his brain. Eventually, they would harden into thick, insensitive calluses, which would then crack open in the cold, starting the whole miserable process over again. In winter, the constant threat of frostbite meant that losing a toe wasn't a distant possibility, but a nightly concern. Let's move to the surface, the body's first line of defense, which in his case had long since surrendered. His skin was a canvas of abuse. In the summer, it was burned by the sun and tanned to the texture of old leather. In the winter, it was raw and chapped, particularly on his face and hands. His body was a roadmap of insect bites, from the swarms of mosquitoes in the wetlands to the fleas and lice that were his roommates in every cheap flophouse and straw cloak. Scrapes and cuts from branches, rocks, or a simple fall were a daily occurrence, and in his unhygienic, malnourished state, these minor wounds rarely healed cleanly. They would fester, turning into angry, pus-filled sores that added yet another layer to his constant discomfort. And his teeth. My God, his teeth. In an era without dentistry, a toothache was not an inconvenience. It was a form of escalating, mind-shattering torture. Lacking a proper diet and any means of cleaning them, his teeth were likely a collection of crumbling, yellowed disasters. A simple cavity would progress unimpeded until it hit the nerve. The pain would be blinding. He would be unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to think. His only options were to endure it, hoping the tooth would rot enough to fall out, or attempt to pull it himself with his fingers or the hilt of his knife, an act of brutal, bloody desperation that often just made things worse. A severe abscess, a pocket of infection in his gum, could easily lead to systemic infection and death. Many a fearsome warrior was laid low not by a sword, but by a molar. But the true horror show was taking place inside. It wasn't just the spectacular injuries or the visible decay. Oh no, his lifestyle was a prolific distributor of fascinating internal afflictions. His digestive system was a constant war zone. The water he drank from streams and wells was a biological lottery, teeming with bacteria and parasites. Dysentery, which he probably just called the running sickness, was a frequent and unwelcome visitor, leaving him weak, dehydrated, and profoundly humiliated, forced to dart into the woods with a sudden, undignified urgency. Chronic food poisoning was a constant risk from scavenged or poorly prepared food, and internal parasites, worms and other horrors, were almost a certainty, silently stealing what little nutrition he managed to consume. His lungs, too, were fighting a losing battle. Constant exposure to damp and cold led to a permanent rattling cough that lived deep in his chest. This cough would rack his body, each spasm sending a jolt of pain through his aching back. In the winter, this persistent cough was the prelude to the real killer: pneumonia. To a man living on the road, without warmth, rest, or medicine, fluid filling the lungs was an almost certain death sentence. The foundation of all this physical ruin was chronic malnutrition. Hunger wasn't just a feeling, it was a process. It was his body, denied external fuel, beginning to cannibalize itself. First the fat, then the muscle. His once powerful samurai physique would waste away, leaving him gaunt and sinewy. This wasn't just about looking thin. It meant a catastrophic loss of strength. It meant his immune system was shot, leaving him vulnerable to every passing illness. It meant a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that sleep barely dented. He was living in a state of perpetual energy deficit, a walking ghost running on fumes. And as his body was engaged in this constant losing battle, his mind was fighting its own silent, and perhaps even more brutal war. The first front in this war was fear. Not the noble, exhilarating fear of battle, but a constant, low-grade, grinding anxiety. It was the ever-present hum of 100 small terrors. The fear of starving, the fear of freezing, the fear of his sandals finally disintegrating miles from the nearest town, the fear of the rattling cough turning into something worse, the fear of being shaken down by bandits, the fear of being arrested by a suspicious magistrate. This fear was a poison that seeped into everything, denying him even a moment's peace. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing monotony, the endless repetition of the road, another sunrise, another muddy path, another suspicious village, another hungry night. The world shrank until it was nothing but the next step, and the one after that. The lack of purpose was a heavy, invisible weight. He was trained to be a decisive instrument of a Lord's will, and now he was just drifting. This erosion of agency, the feeling that he was no longer in control of his own life, was profoundly dehumanizing. The most vicious battle, however, was fought against the ghost of his own honor. A civil war raged within him. His training, his entire identity, screamed at him to be stoic, to be proud, to uphold the tenets of Bushido. But his screaming stomach demanded that he beg. His aching body begged him to steal a warmer cloak. His survival instinct urged him to run from a fight he couldn't win. Every time he groveled for work, every time he accepted a handout with a bowed head, every time he swallowed an insult from a fat merchant, a part of the samurai inside him died. The shame was a corrosive acid, eating away at his sense of self. He was profoundly, terrifyingly alone. The constant suspicion he faced from others built a wall around him, a fortress of isolation. He had no one to confide in, no one to share the burden with. The silence of the road would stretch for days, broken only by the sound of his own coughing and the frantic looping arguments inside his own head. How did he cope? Perhaps on good days he found a quiet spot to practice Zen meditation, a tool from his old life he could use to briefly empty his mind and find a moment of stillness in the chaos. But those moments were fleeting. More often, the coping mechanism was to build a shell, a fortress of bleak, cynical resignation. He would retreat so far into himself that nothing could touch him. He might be prone to flashes of sudden, impotent rage at a world that had no place for him. And if by some miracle he managed to earn a few coins, the temptation of a gourd of cheap, harsh sake would be immense. Not for pleasure, but for oblivion. A few hours of warm, blurry nothingness to silence the ghosts, to numb the pain in his body and the far greater pain in his soul. This wasn't a life. It was a slow-motion demolition of a man, from the outside in and the inside out. A man can perhaps grow accustomed to the mindless cruelty of nature and the predictable decay of his own body. The rain doesn't hate you personally, and a toothache isn't plotting against you. But the one element a suffering man can never truly insulate himself from is the ingenuity and creativity of his fellow human beings in finding new and exciting ways to make his life a living hell. If our Ronin thought he could find solace in human interaction, he was in for a series of profound and continuous disappointments. Travel, especially in his precarious position, rarely happens in a vacuum. It happens in a crowded, judgmental, and often predatory world that viewed him as a problem to be avoided, a tool to be used, or a mark to be exploited. His most common interaction was with the salt of the earth, the common folk of the villages and towns he passed through. And for the most part, they treated him like a walking plague. Imagine the scene. Our Ronin, gaunt and grim-faced, limps into a small village nestled in a valley. He's not looking for trouble. He's hoping to trade a bit of menial labor for a meal. But the moment he appears, a switch is flipped. The cheerful chatter of the peasants in the fields dies down. A farmer pauses, his hand resting defensively on his hoe. A woman in the doorway of a hut quickly shuffles her children inside, her eyes wide with fear. The entire village holds its breath. They don't see a tragic figure of fallen nobility. They see a hungry ghost, a potential bandit, an omen of violence. They see the two swords at his hip, and their minds fill with stories of masterless samurai who turned to extortion and murder. If he tried to buy something, a local merchant would eye him with a mixture of fear and contempt, often quoting him a price double what he'd charge anyone else, assuming the vagrant even had coins. More likely, he'd be met with a firm, "We have nothing for you here," the unspoken addendum being, "So please move on before you attract trouble or try to rob us." Every silent, accusing stare, every slammed door, every clutched purse was another small cut, another reinforcement of his profound isolation. He was not part of their world. He was a threat to it. But sometimes, his fearsome appearance was exactly what someone was looking for. And this led him into the delightful world of temporary employment, a rogues gallery of clients who managed to be even less pleasant than the peasants. Let us meet some of his potential employers. First, there's the arrogant merchant. Picture a portly silk trader named Kenjiro, a man whose wealth is matched only by his spectacular lack of self-awareness. Kenjiro needs to transport his goods through a mountain pass notorious for bandits, so he decides to hire a yojimbo, a bodyguard. Our Ronin, his stomach aching with hunger, agrees to a pitifully low wage. From that moment on, he is not a skilled warrior. He is a piece of ambulatory equipment. Kenjiro will complain about the Ronin's shabby appearance. He'll make him walk in the mud while he rides in a comfortable palanquin. He will expect the Ronin to stand guard all night in the freezing rain outside the inn, while the merchant himself is warm inside, feasting and drinking. The Ronin's very presence, his aura of quiet lethality, is enough to deter any opportunistic thugs. The journey passes without incident. Does the merchant thank him? Does he offer a bonus for a job well done? Of course not. He simply pays the agreed-upon pittance, perhaps even trying to dock a few coins for some imagined slight, and dismisses him without a second glance. The Ronin's competence wasn't appreciated. It was the bare minimum expectation. He was a tool, and once the job was done, he was tossed back onto the scrap heap. Then there's the sleazy gambling boss. In the back alleys of a bustling city, our Ronin might find work with a man like Ryuji, a criminal whose kimono is finer than any the Ronin has ever owned. Ryuji doesn't care about honor. He cares about fear, and our Ronin has that in spades. The work is ugly. It's not defending the innocent. It's intimidating them. He'll be sent to collect a debt from a terrified artisan who can't pay. He'll have to stand silently in the corner of a rigged gambling den, his hand on his sword, his presence ensuring that the fleeced patrons don't get any ideas about revenge. Here, for the first time in months, he might eat regularly. He might have a roof over his head, but the cost is catastrophic. He is using the sacred skills of the samurai. The arts he was taught were for protecting his lord and upholding justice, to be a common thug. The self-loathing that bubbles up as he terrorizes a weeping family is a poison far more potent than any contaminated water. This isn't just a job. It's an active desecration of his soul. Or consider the special psychological torture of working for the spoiled son of a minor official. A bored, wealthy bureaucrat decides his indolent, pudgy son needs to learn the sword to build character. Our Ronin is hired as an instructor for a pittance. He has to stand in a pristine garden and patiently attempt to teach a boy who holds a practice sword with the enthusiasm of a dead fish. The boy will whine, complain, and show a staggering lack of talent. The Ronin, whose own father would have beaten him for such insolence, must bow his head and say, "A worthy attempt, young master. Let us try again." The boy's father will often watch from his porch, sipping tea and loudly criticizing the Ronin's teaching methods. It is a masterclass in humiliation, a slow, grinding degradation that makes a clean death in battle seem like a delightful vacation. In all these scenarios, the theme of appreciation is a ghost at the feast. No one ever said, "Thank you for channeling a lifetime of brutal training into ensuring my safe passage." Gratitude was a foreign currency. His reward for success was simply the continuation of his miserable existence. His punishment for failure, real or perceived, was destitution or death. But what about his own kind? What about his fellow sufferers, the other wave men drifting on the same sea of misery? Surely here he could find some camaraderie, some brotherhood. Yes and no. It was a complicated and dangerous fraternity. An encounter with another Ronin on a lonely road was a moment of supreme tension. The two would approach each other cautiously, like wary dogs. There would be a silent, instantaneous assessment. Is he desperate? Is he insane? Is he better than me? The conversation, if any, would be clipped and formal, a series of grunts and nods. But beneath the surface, there could be a flicker of connection, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared plight. One might give a subtle nod in the direction of a town. Magistrate in Matsuida is hiring for the festival. Or a warning. Bandits on the Nakasendo Pass, 5 of them. Good. This was the Ronin Information Network. Grim, efficient, and built on the understanding that they were the only ones who truly understood their situation. It was a brief, lonely comfort. In the cheapest flophouses of the cities, several might gather, sharing a corner of a smoky, noisy room. Here, a rough sort of community could form. Fueled by cheap, harsh sake, they might let their guards down. They would complain about a particularly awful merchant. They would tell a darkly humorous story about a disastrous attempt to find work. They might even practice forms together in a quiet courtyard, a sad, ghostly echo of their dojo days. Laughter, when it occurred, was a harsh, barking sound, stripped of all genuine joy. It was the laughter of the damned, a shared gallows humor that was the only medicine they had against despair. But this grim camaraderie was as fragile as a spider's web. They were all rivals, competing for the same handful of miserable jobs. If word got out that a local temple needed a guard, any sense of brotherhood would evaporate into a cloud of desperate ambition. They would lie to each other, misdirect each other, and undercut each other's prices. The brutal calculus of survival meant that another Ronin's starvation was your opportunity for a full belly. It was a society where the conditions for solidarity were constantly being undermined by the very desperation they created. They were brothers in misery, but their misery also ensured they could never truly be brothers. There's a certain romantic appeal to the idea of the Spartan warrior, the hero who scorns comfort, who finds strength in asceticism, who can meditate for hours on an empty stomach and sleep peacefully on a bed of rocks. It's a lovely thought. It's also a complete and utter fantasy, invented by people who have never had to actually try it. For our Ronin, his lifestyle wasn't a noble philosophical choice. It was a non-consensual, head-first dive into the very bottom of the hierarchy of needs. His existence was a masterclass in the profound difference between minimalism, a fashionable choice for the wealthy, and destitution, the grim reality for the poor. Let's begin with the most fundamental luxury of all, food. Dining for the wandering Ronin was a culinary tour of despair, an experience that made his already grim existence demonstrably worse. The foundation of his diet, the very bedrock of his daily caloric intake, was not the fluffy white rice of his former station. White rice was a status symbol, the currency in which his family's stipend had been paid. To eat it was to taste prosperity. No, his new reality was a different grain entirely. It was millet. Coarse, gritty, yellow millet, boiled in water into a joyless porridge called kibi-meshi. Let us not mince words. This stuff was appalling. It had a texture somewhere between wet sand and gravel, and its flavor was best described as a vague hint of dirt. It was sustenance in its most brutally technical form, providing just enough energy to fuel the search for more of itself. This bland, depressing slurry was the best-case scenario for a typical day. It was often accompanied by a side of pickled radish, daikon if he was lucky, whose aggressive saltiness served only to highlight the profound blandness of the main course. From this bleak foundation, his diet could branch out into a sad little tree of possibilities, almost all of them rooted in scavenging. On an average day, he was a hunter-gatherer, but not in the noble, prehistoric sense. He was gathering wild mountain vegetables, sansai, which were often fibrous and bitter. He might spend an hour digging up tough, starchy roots. He would gather acorns, then spend another hour trying to leach the bitter tannins out of them so they wouldn't taste like a chemical fire. He would become an amateur mycologist, studying mushrooms with a desperate focus, knowing that a misidentification wouldn't just mean an upset stomach, but a writhing, agonizing death alone in the woods. Every meal foraged from the wild was a low-stakes game of Russian roulette. Protein was a myth, a distant memory of a better life. But sometimes, the universe would throw him a bone. He might manage to trap a small, scrawny rabbit, or a field mouse. Or, with immense patience and a crude makeshift line, he might pull a tiny fish from a stream. This was a moment of triumph, a rare feast. A triumph that was immediately followed by the challenge of cooking his prize. Without a pot or proper utensils, his only option was to impale the sad little creature on a stick and hold it over a smoky, inconsistent fire. The result was almost always a culinary disaster, a piece of meat that was somehow both burnt to a crisp on the outside and disturbingly raw on the inside. He would eat it anyway, gnawing every last shred of flesh from the bone, the taste of ash and desperation filling his mouth. On a truly bad day, scavenging failed. This is when he faced the ultimate humiliation: begging. He might lurk near a monastery, hoping for a handout of leftover rice from the monks. Or he might simply have to beg from travelers on the road, his head bowed, his samurai pride screaming in silent, impotent rage. The act of eating itself was stripped of all dignity. It wasn't a peaceful, mindful ritual. It was a frantic, hurried shoveling of food into his mouth, his eyes darting around nervously like a stray dog, terrified that someone or something would try to take his pathetic, hard-won meal. Now, where to enjoy this fine dining? This brings us to the second luxury, shelter. Home for the Ronin was not where the heart was. It was wherever he could collapse without being immediately arrested or eaten by wolves. His default setting was, of course, the great outdoors. But you can't just sleep anywhere. The nightly search for lodging was a pathetic parody of house hunting. He needed a spot that was hidden from the main road to avoid bandits and officials. It needed some cover from the wind, and ideally the rain, so he'd look for a dense copse of trees or a slight overhang on a cliff face. It needed to be on high enough ground to avoid flash floods and a quick survey for snakes. Aggressive ant colonies and other hostile residents was mandatory. His bed was whatever he could scrape together. A pile of damp leaves, a patch of pine needles. He'd curl up, pulling his stinking straw cloak around him, and try to ignore the rock digging into his spine and the cold seeping up from the merciless earth. A major upgrade was an abandoned structure. An old, forgotten shrine deep in the woods, a farmer's crumbling and disused woodshed, a bridge to huddle under. These offered the promise of a roof, a leaky, drafty, spider-infested roof, but a roof nonetheless. This was a calculated risk. An abandoned shrine might offer shelter from the rain, but Japanese folklore is absolutely teeming with stories of angry spirits, kami, and mischievous demons, yokai, who haunt such places. Our Ronin, a man of his time, would have had to perform a grim calculation. What's worse, catching a fatal case of pneumonia in the rain, or being cursed and driven mad by the ghost of a forgotten fox spirit? Often the tangible threat of freezing to death won out over the intangible threat of supernatural torment. The pinnacle of luxury, the absolute height of comfort he could aspire to, was a night in a hatago, a cheap inn. If by some miracle he had a few coins, he could purchase this. But let's banish any images of a cozy room with a warm fire. He wasn't paying for a room. He was paying for a space. A few square feet of dirty stained tatami mat in a large communal room. This room would be filled with other travelers, snoring merchants, coughing laborers, drunk pilgrims, and quite possibly other, even more desperate ronin. The air would be thick with the smells of wood smoke, cheap sake, unwashed bodies, and despair. His bed would be a thin, lumpy futon that had likely never been cleaned, and was currently home to a thriving multi-generational family of lice. His pillow was often a hard wooden block. Privacy was a concept as alien as a hot shower. He'd have to sleep with one hand on his swords and the other on his coin pouch, as theft was rampant. This was the 5-star experience. This was what he dreamed of on cold nights in the forest. And this brings us to our final and most elusive luxury, rest. The very notion that night was for uninterrupted restorative sleep was a charming fairy tale. True rest was a fantasy he could never attain, for a multitude of reasons. First, the sheer physical discomfort made it impossible. Whether he was on the cold, hard ground or a lumpy, infested futon, his body was a constant source of distraction. The deep ache in his back, the stabbing pain in his knees, the incessant itching from dozens of insect bites, the rattling cough in his chest, these all conspired to keep him hovering in a state of light, fitful, unsatisfying dozing. Second, his mind refused to switch off. Years of samurai training and his current precarious existence had hardwired him for hypervigilance. He was sleeping, but he was never truly off duty. Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl, Every cough from the man next to him on the floor would jolt him into instant, heart-pounding alertness. His mind was a permanent sentry, pacing the battlements of his consciousness, refusing to stand down. He slept not like a baby, but like a soldier in a foxhole. And on the rare occasions he did fall into a deeper sleep, the abyss of his subconscious offered no escape. His dreams were not of peaceful meadows or past glories. They were a chaotic montage of his anxieties. He would dream he was back in his lord's castle on the day it was surrendered, forced to relive the moment his world ended. He would have stress dreams where he drew his katana, only to find the blade a crumbling bar of rust. He would dream of his sandals dissolving into dust miles from anywhere, or of being chased by officials, his legs heavy as stone. Sleep wasn't a refuge. It was just a different kind of torment. The cumulative effect of this chronic sleep deprivation was devastating. It compounded every other misery. It weakened his already compromised immune system. It shattered his focus and dulled his legendary reflexes, making him clumsy and vulnerable. It frayed his nerves, leaving him irritable, paranoid, and prone to irrational decisions. Sleep was not his ally. It was a nightly battle he always lost, ensuring that he would wake up the next morning not refreshed, but simply a little more broken than the day before. There is a fundamental, soul-crushing conflict at the heart of the samurai ethos, a conflict that the peace of the Edo period threw into painfully sharp relief. A samurai was trained to disdain money. Commerce was dirty. The handling of coin was the work of merchants, a lower class of being obsessed with profit. The warrior's currency was honor. His wealth was his loyalty. His bottom line was his glory. This is a beautiful philosophy when you have a lord who guarantees your housing and pays you a generous stipend in rice. It is a catastrophic, unworkable, and frankly idiotic philosophy when you are unemployed and a single daikon radish has a price tag. Our Ronin was a man whose entire spiritual and ethical framework was designed for a world that no longer existed, and he was now forced to navigate a world that ran on the one thing he was taught to despise. He was about to get a series of brutal lessons in the unforgiving science of supply and demand. The supply of masterless swordsmen was high. The demand was, to put it mildly, in a deep recession. So what did getting paid actually look like? The concept of a regular payday involving the satisfying clink of coins was, for most Ronin, a delightful fiction. His income, when it existed at all, came in a variety of pathetic and often humiliating forms. Let's start with the absolute gold standard of payment, the dream scenario, actual coin. If our Ronin successfully completed a bodyguard job for a merchant who wasn't a complete scoundrel, he might be paid in metal currency. He would be handed a string of copper mon, or in a truly exceptional case, perhaps even a silver shoe. The feeling of those small, heavy, real coins in his hand would be a moment of dizzying potential. For a brief, shining instant, he would have agency. He was not just a beggar. He was a customer. This feeling would last precisely as long as it took for him to realize what this fortune could actually buy. His hard-won wages for a week of dangerous work might be enough for 2 or 3 hot meals, a new pair of straw sandals, and maybe one night in that lice-infested flophouse we discussed. It wasn't a wage. It was a temporary stay of execution from starvation. The money flowed through his hands like water, plugging the most immediate leaks in his sinking ship of a life before vanishing completely, leaving him right back where he started. Far more common than coin was the barter system, a return to a more primitive and deeply personal form of economic humiliation. After guarding a shipment of rice for 10 agonizingly long miles, the merchant might pay him with a single scoop of that very rice. He was being compensated with the crumbs from the table he was paid to protect. Other times the payment would be something utterly useless to a wanderer. A grateful artisan might pay him with a finely crafted paper fan. A weaver might give him a small bolt of hemp cloth. Now what? He, a samurai, was forced to become an itinerant peddler, trying to trade a fan for a meal. He'd have to approach a food stall owner and begin the undignified process of haggling. "Sir, this exquisite fan, a true work of art, is surely worth at least 2 bowls of noodles?" The stall owner, seeing a desperate man in ragged clothes, would laugh and offer him 1 bowl, and the ronin, his stomach twisting with shame and hunger, would have no choice but to accept. He was a warrior of a noble house, now reduced to haggling over the price of soup. But the most frequent form of payment wasn't currency or goods. It was simply a meal. He might chase a few local thugs away from a tea house, and the grateful owner would provide him with a bowl of rice and some tea. This was a complex emotional transaction. On the one hand, the sheer, profound relief of a hot meal was undeniable. It was a moment of warmth and satiety in a life defined by cold and hunger. On the other hand, the shame was immense. He was working for table scraps. He was no better than a stray dog that performs a trick for a bit of food. He would eat quickly, his head bowed, avoiding eye contact, the taste of the food mingling with the bitter taste of his own degradation. And on the rare occasions a real wage was agreed upon, there were always the deductions. Oh, the creative accounting of a stingy employer was a marvel to behold. "Yes, I agreed to 50 mon," the merchant would say. "But one of your sandals came untied during the journey, which was unsightly, so I'm deducting 5. And you drank water from my personal gourd, so that's another 3. And I didn't care for the way you were looking at that cloud. It seemed disrespectful, so we'll make it an even 40. The ronin, possessing 0 leverage and facing the prospect of getting nothing at all if he argued, would have to swallow his rage and accept the reduced sum. The system was rigged from top to bottom. This all points to a grand cosmic irony that was the central economic tragedy of the ronin's life, the staggering disconnect between his value as a product and his value on the market. An immense, almost unimaginable investment had gone into creating him. 20 years of relentless, agonizing training, a childhood sacrificed at the altar of martial prowess, the accumulated knowledge of generations of warriors. He had mastered the sword, the spear, the bow, and the art of unarmed combat. He could read, write, and compose poetry. He was, in essence, a walking, breathing, handcrafted weapon of immense sophistication and power. And in the peace of the Edo period, this incredible skill set was worth less than a decent pair of shoes. He was a master watchmaker in a world where the sun was good enough to tell time. He was a brilliant shipwright in the middle of the Sahara. The very swords at his side were a perfect symbol of this economic paradox. A good katana, forged by a master, was an object of immense value, worth enough to buy a house. He was carrying an asset worth more than he could hope to earn in a dozen lifetimes, but it was an asset he could not liquidate. Selling his family's swords would be an act of filial impiety and personal dishonor, so profound as to be unthinkable. It was also illegal, so he was saddled with a priceless object that he couldn't trade for a single rice ball, a constant, taunting reminder of a value he possessed but could never access. His already precarious existence was further buffeted by forces entirely outside his control. His fortunes were lashed to the whims of gods and governments. A bad harvest from a drought or a flood was a catastrophe for everyone. But for the ronin, it was a death knell. Famine meant food prices soared beyond his reach. Peasants and merchants, now starving themselves, had no surplus food or coin to hire guards. Charity, always thin on the ground, evaporated completely. Desperation turned more men into bandits, making the roads more dangerous precisely as the opportunities for legitimate work vanished. Our ronin became just one more starving ghost in a landscape of starving ghosts. The whims of the ruling class were just as dangerous. A local daimyo's procession along the road meant the highways were cleared and security was tightened. A scruffy, masterless samurai lurking about was the first person the authorities would arrest, question, and probably beat, just on principle. A new government edict restricting travel or the carrying of weapons could make his very existence illegal overnight. Sometimes, a massive public works project, a new castle wall, a canal might be announced. Was this an opportunity? Yes, an opportunity for profound humiliation. The foremen were hiring manual laborers, not swordsmen. He might be offered work hauling rocks or digging ditches alongside convicts and peasants for a handful of rice a day. The samurai, the man who stood at the apex of the social order, was now being offered the chance to do the work of the lowest of the low. It was perhaps the final, most definitive statement on his new economic reality. His sword was worthless, but his aching back still had value. A journey, by its very definition, implies a destination. There is a point A and a point B. There is a goal, an objective, an end state that, once reached, signifies completion. A pilgrimage ends at a shrine. A campaign ends in victory or defeat. A merchant's trip ends at the marketplace. The Ronin's travel had no such luxury. He was not on a journey. He was trapped in a condition. His movement was not linear. It was circular, a constant weary gyre of wandering. He wasn't going to anywhere. He was simply going. The concept of finishing was a quaint notion from a former life. His to-do list was brutally, elegantly simple. Suffer, survive, repeat. Deep within the shattered remnants of his samurai psyche, there was likely a fantasy, a desperate, flickering hope that kept him putting one miserable foot in front of the other. It was the myth of the one big job. He told himself that this endless wandering was temporary, a prelude to the moment his luck would turn. He would find a new lord, a wise and discerning daimyo who would recognize his skill and loyalty and take him into service. Or he would perform some spectacular feat of heroism, saving a whole town or a high-ranking official, and be rewarded with a purse of gold large enough to buy a small farm and retire from this life of misery. This was the boulder he pushed up the hill every single day, the belief that the summit was just over the next rise. But it never was. The reality of his life was a chain of interlocking, repeating micro-miseries. A success for him did not mean an end to his troubles. It meant a brief, temporary pause. Let's follow a typical loop. After weeks of near starvation, our Ronin gets a job in a town. Let's call it Odawara. He's hired to guard a shipment of pottery being transported to a monastery in the Hakone Mountains. For 5 days, he walks, vigilant and hungry, protecting fragile clay pots with his life. He succeeds. Nothing is broken or stolen. He arrives, gets paid his pittance, just enough for a new pair of sandals and a few days' worth of food, and is dismissed. He is now in the mountains, alone. What now? He hears a rumor that a merchant in Odawara is looking for extra muscle, and so he turns around and walks back the way he came, along the same dreary road, his new sandals already beginning to wear thin. He is a human shuttle, a living cargo vessel, moving the wealth of a nation he has no share in, between places that will never be his home. His entire existence was like a leaky boat in a vast ocean. He would spend all his energy bailing out the water, the hunger, the cold, only to have it seep back in through a dozen other cracks. He fixes his sandal, but then his cloak tears. He earns enough for food, but then he develops a hacking cough. He finds a dry place to sleep, but his water runs out. There was no state of equilibrium. There was no fixed. There was only the endless, exhausting, and ultimately futile cycle of maintenance on the crumbling infrastructure of his own life. This personal cycle of futility was tethered to the grand, indifferent rhythms of the seasons, a hamster wheel he could not escape. Spring would arrive with a great, muddy sigh. The winter snows would melt, turning the roads into impassable quagmires of sucking mud, Travel was slow and treacherous, yet the world was waking up. This was the planting season. Seeds and tools needed to move between villages. The Ronin's world was one of supply and demand. As the world moved, he might find work. But the thaw also released every other desperate soul from their winter confinement. The roads would be thick with other wanderers, other beggars, other Ronin, all competing for the same scarce resources. Spring wasn't a time of renewal for him. It was the start of another year of struggle. Summer brought oppressive heat and suffocating humidity. This was the peak travel season for merchants and pilgrims, and in theory, the most opportunity for work. The Great Tokaido Road would be bustling, but the heat, the dust, and the swarms of insects made every step a misery. Disease thrived in the warmth. A simple gut sickness could easily become deadly. The competition for jobs was fierce. For every merchant looking for a guard, there were 10 Ronin lined up, each willing to do the job for less than the next man. Autumn was the season of false hope. The harvest. This was the busiest time of year. Rice, the lifeblood of Japan, was being moved from the countryside to the castles and cities. The roads were filled with valuable shipments that needed protection. Festivals were held to celebrate the harvest, and these events needed security. For a brief, shining period, the demand for men with swords was at its peak. This was the time our Ronin's boulder got closest to the top of the hill. He might string together several small jobs, eat regularly for a few weeks, and perhaps even save a few coins. He might, for a moment, believe the cycle was broken. Then came winter. The world died, and so did his opportunities. Snow would blanket the land, closing mountain passes and making travel next to impossible. The rivers would freeze. Merchants and travelers stayed home. The world shut down, and our Ronin was shut out. Work vanished completely. Winter was a season of pure, brutal survival. It was a time of huddling in an abandoned shed, slowly starving, rationing out the pathetic savings from autumn, and trying not to freeze to death in his sleep. All the progress he'd made was erased. The boulder had rolled all the way back to the bottom of the hill, and he was right there with it, waiting for the mud of spring to begin the cycle all over again. It would be an insult to suggest that this life contained anything approaching joy. It didn't. Yet, even in the deepest, darkest pit of daily misery, the human spirit, especially one forged in the fires of samurai discipline, can sometimes find the tiniest, most improbable cracks of light. These weren't moments of happiness. They were fleeting affirmations of existence, tiny gasps of air in an ocean of suffocation. There might be a grim flicker of professional pride. He might be practicing his sword forms, his kata, alone by a river at dawn. His body would forget its aches, his mind would forget its hunger, and for a single, fluid sequence of movements, he would be perfect. The blade would sing in the air, his feet would be rooted to the earth, his form flawless. In that instant, he wasn't a ragged beggar. He was a master of his art, a living embodiment of a noble tradition. The feeling would vanish as soon as he stopped. But for a second he remembered what he was. Sometimes it was a moment of nonviolent success. He'd be confronted by a few belligerent drunks in a village. Instead of drawing his sword, he would simply meet their gaze, his hand resting on the hilt, his posture radiating a quiet, terrifying competence. The drunks would falter, their bravado evaporating under the weight of his presence, and they would shuffle away, muttering curses. He had won without fighting. It was a victory of spirit and discipline, a testament to the fact that his greatest weapon wasn't the steel at his side, but the lifetime of training within him. There was the camaraderie of shared despair, huddled under a leaky temple gate with another Ronin during a typhoon, the wind howling, the rain coming down in sheets. One might look at the other, shivering, soaked to the bone, and say with a perfectly straight face, "The life of a warrior is truly glorious." The other would reply with a short, harsh bark of a laugh. It was a joke so bleak it circled all the way back to being funny. It was a tiny spark of connection, a shared acknowledgement of the absurdity of their situation that made it for a moment just slightly more bearable. And sometimes, it was even simpler. It was the unexpected kindness of a farmer's wife who gave him a hot-baked sweet potato instead of just scraps. It was the shocking, sublime taste of that simple sweetness after weeks of eating bitter roots and gritty millet. It was the profound beauty of a perfect, snow-capped Mount Fuji seen at a distance on a clear winter morning. These moments provided no solutions. They didn't fill his stomach for long or mend his clothes, but they were proof that the world was not made entirely of suffering. They were the tiny, scattered fleas of joy you might find, if you looked very hard, on an otherwise mangy and miserable existence. No man, not even one forged in the stoic fires of Bushido, can outrun time. And for the Ronin, time was not a gentle river carrying him towards a peaceful sea. It was an abrasive tide, relentlessly grinding him down, eroding his body, his skills, and his spirit, until only a husk remained. The end of his journey was not a destination, but a disintegration, and it came in one of two heartbreaking forms: the quiet agony of perpetuating the cycle, or the lonely horror of being broken by it. Let us first consider a scenario that is, in its own way, the most tragic of all. The Ronin who, against all odds, finds a semblance of a life. Perhaps in a dusty, forgotten town, he marries the daughter of a peasant, a woman who sees past the ragged clothes to the weary sadness in his eyes. Or perhaps he takes in the widow and child of another fallen warrior. He settles. He stops wandering. He has a family. And he discovers that this fragile island of stability in his ocean of misery is a new and far more profound form of terror. He now has so much more to lose. And he has a son. He would look at this boy, a child with bright, curious eyes, not yet clouded by despair, and a complex, bitter brew of emotions would churn in his gut. There would be a fierce, protective love, an instinct so powerful it physically hurt. And right behind it, a tidal wave of guilt. Guilt for bringing this child into a world of poverty and shame. Guilt that this boy would be known in the village not as a samurai's heir, but as the son of the masterless man, the outsider. Guilt for giving him nothing but a legacy of failure. The central crisis of his life would now revolve around the two swords hanging on the wall of his tiny, squalid hut. To teach his son the way of the sword was, in his mind, the sacred duty of a samurai father. It was the only thing of value he possessed, the one true link to a nobler past. It was the core of his identity. But every fiber of his being, every painful memory of his own life on the road, would scream that it was a curse. To teach his son the sword in this era was to teach him a dead language that people hated you for speaking. It was to meticulously prepare him for a job that didn't exist. It was handing him a key to a house that had burned down a generation ago. It was shackling him to the same leaking barge of a life he himself had been trapped on. The boy, of course, would see none of this. He would look at his quiet, grim father with awe. He would see the swords not as burdens, but as objects of legendary power, symbols of a secret and wonderful world. He would beg to be taught. "Father, show me. When can I hold the long sword?" Each question would be another twist of the knife in the old Ronin's heart. Eventually, torn between duty and despair, he might relent, and the training would begin. But it would be a hollow echo of his own upbringing. His father had taught him with pride, with a sense of glorious purpose. Our Ronin teaches his son with a heavy, leaden heart. As he corrects the boy's stance, showing him how to grip the heavy wooden bakken, his mind is not on the form. It's on the future. He sees his son, grown, using this very skill not in a noble duel, but in a filthy tavern brawl over a gambling debt. He sees this art, meant for the battlefield, being used to intimidate a shopkeeper for a handful of rice. He is not passing on a noble tradition. He is passing on a tool for survival in a degraded world. He would bark at him, just as his father barked at him, but the old commands, stronger, faster, focus, now had a silent, desperate addendum in his mind, so that you might survive the miserable life I have given you. Each lesson was an act of love poisoned by the deep, unshakable fear that he was simply training his own son for a more violent and tragic death. He was not passing a torch, he was passing a disease. Now consider the alternative path. The Ronin who never settles, who stays on the road until the very end. For him, the end comes not with the cry of a newborn, but with a series of quiet, final betrayals from the one thing he had always relied upon, his own body. The road, like a cruel moneylender, always collects its debts. And after decades of relentless abuse, our Ronin's body begins its final, catastrophic default. The chronic aches and pains of his middle years now blossom into full-blown, debilitating conditions. The arthritis that had once been a nagging discomfort now becomes a fire in his joints. His hands, which could once draw his sword in a flash, are now gnarled, swollen claws. Gripping his katana is an exercise in pure agony. Wielding it effectively is a distant memory. His legendary eyesight, worn down by years of squinting at dusty horizons and sleeping in smoky rooms, begins to fail. The world becomes a blurry, indistinct place. He can no longer spot a potential threat from a distance, can no longer read the subtle intentions in a stranger's face. He, a man who lived by his heightened senses, is being walled off from the world, betrayed from within. That persistent cough that rattled in his chest for years has now deepened, becoming a racking, breathless spasm that can seize him for minutes at a time. The simple act of walking up a hill leaves him gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. He is weak, and he knows it. And this is the deepest cut of all, the slow, dawning, terrifying realization of his own obsolescence. The world, which had already made his skills obsolete, now finds the man himself to be redundant. He starts to notice the way younger men on the road walk, with a speed and confidence he can no longer muster. He sees a group of bandits, and the old instinct to assess and engage is replaced by a new, cold calculation of how fast he can hide. He who was once the predator is now definitively the prey. The final crushing humiliation comes when he seeks work. A merchant in need of a bodyguard looks at him and sees not a fearsome warrior, but a decrepit old man with a cough. The merchant's gaze slides right past him, landing on a younger, stronger Ronin standing nearby. He is no longer even worth haggling with. The one thing he had left to sell, his intimidating presence, has expired. So what happens now? What is the retirement plan for a masterless samurai in feudal Japan? There isn't one. There is no pension, no veterans' care, no respectful home for aged warriors. When you could no longer pull your weight, you were simply finished. A mouth to feed without the hands to earn it. His final days could play out in one of a few grim scenarios. Perhaps, swallowing the last, bitter remnants of his pride, he throws himself on the mercy of a Buddhist monastery. If they accept him, he might live out his last year or two as a lay servant, sweeping the temple gardens and chopping vegetables, his once mighty sword stored away, finally and forever useless. He would die quietly, anonymously, his passing marked only by the monks who would cremate his body and place his ashes in an unmarked corner of the cemetery. More likely, he would simply fade away in the anonymous cruelty of a city. He would find a back alley and beg, his voice a weak rasp. The days would blur into a haze of hunger and cold, until one morning, huddled against a wall for a warmth that isn't there, he simply wouldn't wake up. His body, just another piece of urban refuse, would be found by a street sweeper, bundled into a straw mat, and dumped into a common grave with the other nameless dead. Or maybe, just maybe, in a last defiant flicker of the samurai spirit, he chooses his own end. Knowing he is too weak to work and too proud to beg any longer, he walks into a gambling den and purposefully insults the local crime boss, or he challenges a young, arrogant, and clearly superior samurai in the service of a lord. He knows he cannot win, but he can choose to die on his feet with a sword in his hand, its familiar weight a final comfort. It is a pathetic, back-alley parody of the glorious death in battle he was raised to expect. But it is an end he chooses. It is the last act of a man who has lost everything, trying desperately, in his final moments, to reclaim the narrative of his own life. So we leave him there, in the cold earth of an unmarked grave, or as a puff of smoke from a monastery chimney. A life of relentless hardship, of quiet desperation, ending in the profound and final anonymity he had known for most of his adult years. It is a bleak and deeply unsatisfying end to a single tragic story. But our Ronin was not one man. He was one of tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands. And the true staggering legacy of the Ronin is not found in the story of any one man's suffering, but in the collective, crushing weight of all of it. To understand what all that misery achieved, we have to look past the man and see the historical force he became. The great shoguns of the Tokugawa clan, the powerful daimyo in their magnificent castles, their names are carved in stone and written in the grand scrolls of history. They are remembered as the architects of a great and lasting peace, an era of unprecedented stability and cultural flourishing that lasted for over 250 years. They built the grand, soaring obelisk of the Edo period. But every great structure needs a foundation, and often that foundation is ugly, messy, and buried deep in the dirt, forgotten by all who admire the spire. The Ronin, in their countless anonymous multitudes, were that foundation. When the Tokugawa shogunate ended the civil wars, they solved one problem, constant warfare, but created another, massive one, a huge, unemployed class of highly trained professional killers. History shows us what usually happens in these situations. These men, with no other skills and a deep-seated resentment, should have become a plague of banditry on a scale that would have torn the nation apart. They should have formed private armies, hired themselves out to ambitious lords, and plunged Japan right back into another century of bloody civil war. That is what should have happened. But for the most part, it didn't. And why not? Because the vast majority of these men, these Ronin, did something far more difficult and far less glorious. They endured. They chose the lonely, miserable road of personal suffering over the path of organized rebellion. They absorbed the seismic shock of Japan's transition from war to peace with their own bodies and their own souls. They were the social safety valve that prevented the new engine of state from exploding. Their collective, individual misery was the silent, unacknowledged price of national stability. Each hungry night, each humiliating job, each lonely death in a ditch was a tiny, infinitesimal payment on the mortgage of peace. Their legacy is therefore hidden in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of the era that scorned them. Think of that cowardly merchant, the one who underpaid our Ronin to guard his pottery. That merchant, and thousands like him, were the lifeblood of the burgeoning Edo economy. The silk, the sake, the rice, the iron, the entire circulatory system of a nation, flowed along the roads and highways. And that flow was made just a little bit safer, a little more reliable, by the grim, ever-present reality of for-hire swordsmen. The Ronin, in his pathetic, desperate quest for a single meal, was an unwitting and unpaid agent of national commerce, He was the grit in the gears of the system that kept the bandits and thugs at bay, just enough for the economy to flourish. Think of the vibrant culture of the floating world, the ukiyo-e, the boisterous kabuki theaters of Edo, the elegant tea houses of Kyoto, the brilliant woodblock prints of Hokusai and Hiroshige that would one day stun the Western world. This explosion of art and culture was predicated on a stable, prosperous urban environment. That stability required a baseline of order, an order maintained in part by men like our Ronin. Whether he was working as a quasi-official guard for a magistrate, or simply acting as a deterrent to street crime through his fearsome presence, he was a part of the unseen scaffolding that allowed that culture to be built. The poet wrote his verse in a city made marginally safer by the man who could not afford to buy the book it would be printed in. And here lies the final, most profound irony. The Ronin's most visible and lasting legacy is the very myth that we have spent this entire time dismantling. Over the centuries, the grim reality of their suffering, the hunger, the sickness, the shame, was laundered. It was bleached of its filth and pain and woven into heroic fiction. The desperate, mangy stray dog was reborn as the noble lone wolf. The stories of their squalid reality were transformed into inspiring tales of stoic self-sacrifice, of wandering heroes upholding justice. This fictional Ronin became a cornerstone of Japanese culture, a powerful archetype of honor and resilience that endures to this day. His greatest legacy is a story that utterly erases his truth. So the next time you see that iconic image, the lone swordsman in his straw hat, silhouetted against a setting sun, spare a thought for the man who was actually there. A man whose feet were a landscape of blisters, whose stomach was a hollow cavern of hunger, and whose heart was a cold, heavy stone of shame. He sought no glory, and in the end, history granted his wish with absolute perfection. He received none. Yet, in his unceasing labor, in his stubborn endurance, in his endless, thankless, miserable journey, he was more than just a sufferer. He was a fundamental part of the great, unseen engine that powered a civilization. He was the friction that slowed his society's descent into chaos. He wasn't just a wave man, tossed about on the currents of fate. He and his countless forgotten brothers were the current, the deep, slow-moving, invisible river of human endurance upon which the great ship of the Tokugawa state sailed, peacefully and unaware for 2.5 centuries. His name is forgotten. His pain is unimaginable. But the peace he inadvertently purchased with his own misery became the foundation of an era.